Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features, or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Hey, compañeros, back again with episode 82. Hello, Steve.
Hey, Carlos. Episode 82 is the second half. Episode 82 is the second half of the indexing episode.
Yes, our conversation with Randolph West. I think the first half went very, very well, getting lots of good comments there, which we'll reach out to in a minute. But here we kind of pick up and we're going to finish that conversation talking a little bit about the care and feeding and some of those components there.
Yep, very important stuff for keeping your indexes working well.
That's right. And I think one of those things, and one of the reasons I love doing this podcast is inviting people in, talking about how they're doing these things, because there's always different points of view or thoughts about attacking some of this. And Randolph does a great job of bringing up some really interesting points. And so I enjoyed the conversation.
Yep. It's always interesting to talk to someone who has dealt with the problems along the way and learned from it over the years and really knows what he's talking about there.
Exactly. Okay, so we do have a couple of compañero shout-outs. Let's see. Our first comes from Jason Hamley.
Yes.
So he's been enjoying the podcast and wanted to take a peek at the checklist and has asked for some Hyper-V specific situations. So that might be a scenario that we cover in a future episode there as well.
Yep, very good point. That would be worth calling out a little bit.
That's right. And of course, Steve, he is a big fan of the Database Health Monitor. So thank you, Jason, for giving us a quick shout out.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear people who are enjoying the Database Health Monitor. So often it goes weeks without hearing anything, but it's good to know that people are using it and loving it.
That's right.
Okay, and the next shout out was from Aaron Hayes.
And this is probably the best LinkedIn wording I've ever heard in my entire life. So, there's that default wording like, please add me to your network or whatever it is. This is what Aaron said when he tried to link in with me.
Keep it up. This is coming from a guy who drank the Oracle Kool-Aid, mainly because I don't have to pay for the licensing. Appreciate your time into it. So thank you, Aaron, for the kind words there. Even though you're drinking the Oracle Kool-Aid, you're loving our podcast.
That's right. Well, from one Kool-Aid drinker to another, right?
Yes.
Welcome aboard. And our last shout out today is going to be to Patrick Flynn, complimenting us on episode 81, our first session of the index.
Yes. So this came from Patrick over Twitter. And Patrick's someone that I've met through the Database Corruption Challenge originally. And he said, very good episode, and also good luck with the pre-con. And the pre-con that he's referring to there is...
Yes. Our one-day training going to be held in Richmond, Virginia, in my hometown. So I've managed to convince Steve to come over to the Greater Coast.
Wait, what? Yeah, I said I'd come to Richmond. I didn't hear anything about the Greater Coast.
Yeah, so we'll be in Richmond, Virginia, doing our one-day pre-con on disaster preparedness for emergency situations.
Yep.
So we'll be talking a little bit about corruption and a little bit about disaster recovery.
Yep.
And preparation.
Yep. And that's on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. And it's Friday, right. The day right before the Richmond, Virginia SQL Saturday event.
Yep.
And on the corruption half of the day, we're going to go into some corrupt databases that I have never demoed before at any presentation or conference. So we'll be able to go further in depth than I've ever had time to do at a conference before.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And the instructions for registration are available on the SQL Saturday site there for the Richmond event. URL for today's show notes is going to be at sqldatapartners.com/index. Again, singular.
Yep. And speaking of conferences like the pre-con, you had mentioned sort of this idea around a lone DBA conference.
Yes.
For those who are kind of the solo DBA, the only one in their company or shop that wears the DBA hat, and they don't always need all of the most cutting edge or like the hot new features that we're talking about every week, but sometimes they just need overview of the fundamentals and how to keep that off-the-shelf product running on SQL Server.
And I think in addition to kind of that training, it's also then to have, to go to a place where everybody knows your name, if you will, right? And while the hashtag SQL help is great, and there's lots of good information on there, how much more enjoyable will that be if you know somebody that you can email, or ping an idea off of when you get stumped?
Yep.
And don't just have to ask your friend Google.
Yep. That's a really good point, because I know every training or seminar or class that I've been part of, the personal relationships, getting to know those other people of who you can ask or who you can talk to when you need help with something is far more valuable than any standalone class. So what we're kind of thinking about doing there is putting together some kind of almost like a networking group with a conference associated with it, sort of build a team of people you can lean on when you need some help.
That's right.
And
it's a little mini conference.
Yeah, and that's specifically focused around sort of the people who are the lone DBA or their part-time DBA trying to do the job of keeping that SQL Server running in their company.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And so we'd like to know if that would be of interest to you. And so if you go to sqldatapartners.com/conference, again, this is just kind of an idea that we have. We'd like to get your email so that we can start asking some questions to see what you'd be most interested in, and where and when might make sense. And then if we get enough people who are interested, we'll take the next step and move forward and actually put some of that together.
Yep. And I think with that, we have ideas on what we think would be worthwhile, but we want to hear from the lone DBAs out there to see what they think would be valuable in that type of a training.
Exactly. So we've gone a bit long with this opening. And so normally we do SQL Server in the news. However, we'll go ahead and keep that 1 week. And let's just go ahead and get into the conversation with Randolph. And then we'll bring back SQL in the news next week.
All right. Sounds good. So then let's jump a little bit more into the care and feeding side of things. And I know we touched a little bit on rebuild and a little bit on, but if we look at what are the general things that we need to do to take care of indexes and keep them well structured on an ongoing basis?
I'd be interested to hear your side because I've been speaking a lot, and I'll jump in if I have any feedback. Yeah.
Okay. So I think on that, there's the concept of reorganizing versus rebuilding as you get fragmentation over time. And then there's statistics. And I think that, let me start with a very bad way of doing it that I see quite often is that if you go in and use one of the default maintenance plans, and the maintenance plan, you just go in and click, let's rebuild my indexes, let's reorganize my indexes, and then let's rebuild statistics. One of the things you end up doing is rebuilding, which basically rebuilds the entire index from scratch without, basically, if you're an enterprise edition, you can do that in an online mode. But if you're not an enterprise edition, that's an offline operation. But what the default maintenance plan people sometimes check is they say, let's rebuild them, and that gives you the best structured index you're probably going to. Default maintenance plan people sometimes check is they say, let's rebuild them, and that gives you the best structured index you're probably going to end up with, and it also rebuilds your statistics. And then they reorganize them, and then they rebuild statistics with like a 5% sampling or something like that. In that example, you end up with a whole lot of work that's actually giving you sort of a negative approach or negative impacts. Whereas if you had just rebuilt them to begin with and then not done the reorg and not done the statistics rebuild afterwards, you would have been in a lot better shape.
So those defaults that you're talking about, the reason that happens is because the maintenance plan wizard has got rebuild, then reorg, then statistics in that order in the list.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And people just click the checkboxes or select them, and that's what you get.
So when I see that, I blame Microsoft for that. That's purely Microsoft's fault because generally people who are using the maintenance wizard are using it because they don't know how to do it with, say, Ola Hellengren or Minionware's tools. So just to name two, there are many. It's not their fault, but it is causing a whole bunch of work that is unnecessary.
Yes, it may not be their fault, but it's their pain they have to deal with. So when I see that, I generally go into a little bit of education to explain why that's bad, and then turn those off. And like you said, replace it with Minionware or Ola Hellengren scripts, both which are far better solutions at doing it than the default maintenance plans.
Yeah. So the one thing I wanted to mention, Steve, is that an index rebuild is, as I mentioned before, a size of data operation. So if your table is 10 gigabytes and you need to rebuild it, if you're doing a clustered index rebuild, it's going to require 10 gigabytes of space in the data file, and it's going to require at least 10 gigabytes in the transaction log. And if you're rebuilding a clustered index, it is going to, by default, rebuild all of the non-clustered indexes on that table that refer to that clustered index. And that means all of them. Yep. So if you've got a 10 gigabyte table and you've got 30 gigabytes of non-clustered indexes on that table, it's going to require at least 40 gigabytes in the data file and 40 gigabytes in the transaction log, because it's going to rebuild everything.
Yep.
So if you've got a maintenance plan that says, let's do a clustered index rebuild, and then before that, you had all of the non-clustered indexes rebuilding, it's going to do them again anyway. Yep. So it's a nightmare. This is why I say statistics updates more regularly are going to be a lot more effective than doing index rebuilds over the long term. You still do need index maintenance, but let's not do it every night.
And that's where I like the third-party solutions that we mentioned there for the ability to rebuild those, where you have options to say, given a certain level of fragmentation, I want to choose to reorganize this. Yep. Or if it's even more fragmented, then we're going to choose to rebuild it. And some of them even have the option of only do this for a certain amount of time.
So can you go into detail what the difference between a rebuild and a reorg is?
Okay, so with the rebuild, technically it's like the equivalent of if you had dropped the index and recreated it, in that it's going to be completely rebuilt from scratch, and it'll take up the log and disk I/O like you talked about a moment ago. But with the reorg, what that's going to do is going to go into the index and basically restructure or compact the index pages as needed. It'll go through and shuffle them around to compact them down to a smaller amount of space. And it'll do that page by page as it goes through there. And that can be done while things are online in standard edition. But it's slow, and the end outcome is not as good as a complete rebuild. It might get you real close, but it's not going to be as good as a complete rebuild. But the benefit is you can keep it online.
And you still need to update the statistics after you've done a reorganization, which is something that people tend to forget as well.
Yep.
So the statistics need to be up to date so that the query optimizer knows where the data is and how much of it is in there, and what the distribution of the data is in that index, so that it can make the right choice about what type of query to create. Because a lot of queries come down to sorts and joins. And that's where you find your biggest performance bottlenecks. A sort is a blocking operation, so everything in the query has to stop until the sort is finished. So if your index is up to date and it's sorted correctly, then it doesn't have to do that operation. It's already done. A whole bunch of things about loops we can talk about here as well, which I'm not going to. But an up-to-date statistic is much more valuable to the query optimizer than a defragmented index.
There's another point there, even that we've talked about care and feeding of the indexes, right? Rebuilds versus reorgs. However, we can also have statistics that are outside of the indexes, right? Yeah. On the table. Those are also providing feedback to SQL Server. If we neglect those, we're kind of still at that same peril, because the optimizer may be using those statistics, but we're not giving them that care and feeding.
Correct. So it's valuable to have I hate this word, holistic approach to your care and feeding, is that you need to look at not just indexes and not just fragmentation and not just statistics, but all of them, and in a way that is effective and efficient for your maintenance window. You don't want to go and rebuild indexes every night because it doesn't make any sense, but you also don't want to stop doing statistics updates.
One thing I commonly see with that is rebuilding of the statistics or updating the statistics, where somebody will have a job that just goes through and blindly updates every single statistic in the entire database every night. And that can have a pretty big performance impact on things depending on the size of your database. And a better approach to do that is to look at which tables or indexes have actually had changes, and only update those that have a fair amount of changes to them on that frequent basis. And then maybe on a regular basis of once a month or once a week, you do an update on across the board on all of them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. In a table, if you've got automatic statistics enabled, we're going to go a little bit of a segue now. By default, automatic statistics are enabled. There are other settings that you can choose. And on 2016, there's a whole bunch of new stuff per database, which you can choose. Let's talk about everything before 2016, because that's what most people are still using. Statistics will only update themselves if a certain percentage of the table has changed. The value has changed across versions recently, but the fact is that statistics will only update themselves if a certain percentage has been changed. So if you've got a really large table with tens of millions of records or rows, and you have only 1 million that have changed recently, statistics will not be updated automatically. So it does pay you to use one of the third-party tools we've mentioned, like Minionware or Ola Hellengren's maintenance solution, where it will go and check, has any number statistics there, and that will help your query optimizer as well.
The other side effect you can get with that is that if you do hit that threshold where it decides it's time to rebuild those statistics, that might be in the middle of your peak load during the day. And right when you've got a lot of traffic coming to your database, a statistic rebuild occurs. That can have impact on things too.
That, in fact, is one of the recommendations for SharePoint-style databases. There's a lot of things I don't like about SharePoint, but the fact is a lot of people use it. So one of their recommendations is to turn off automatic statistics updates on any SharePoint-style database. That includes CRM, it includes Great Plains, all of those, whatever it is. There's a whole bunch of them where you should turn off statistics updates automatically and then include statistics rebuilds in your maintenance plans. So it's just something to keep in mind. Each database is different.
That would probably apply to Navision and
yes, that's the one. That's the one. Yeah.
Dynamics.
That's the one. Yeah.
Dynamics as well.
Yeah. Dynamics is the one I was trying to remember. Thank you. So any SharePoint style database, they do recommend turning off statistics updates automatically and to do them in a separate maintenance window. So it pays to do your research to make sure that you're doing the right kind of maintenance plans for your database and your instance.
Right.
Yep. Very good points.
A couple of different things. We talked about all of these components, and I guess let's talk about some of the benefits, right? So all of these things we have to go in, right? Kind of the holistic approach, having to know our data, getting more familiar with it. Ultimately, to what end are we going to do that? So we've talked a little bit about performance, but I guess we should probably talk about how that performance gets into the system, if you will, or the mechanisms that cause the improvement.
Okay, so when I do my performance session, what I say is you've got your less expensive items like your RAM, and you've got even less expensive items like your hard drives. So your CPU is the most valuable thing to you because the SQL license is per CPU core, and you want to make sure you're using the most efficiencies of your CPU and memory as you can. What an index does is, we spoke about this before, is it's a copy of the data. So you want to keep your indexes as efficient as possible so that if you've got a large table, you don't want your index to be large as well. You want it to be smaller so that less of it is in memory, because that's what this game is about. SQL Server is all about being in memory. Exactly. As much data as possible in memory. So for standard edition, up to 2016 even, you've only got a certain amount of memory that you can access. 2016 Service Pack 1, the limit is still there, but it's your buffer pool that's in memory as opposed to everything. But the fact is that there are limits to the amount of memory you can use for SQL Server, specifically with standards in memory as opposed to everything. But the fact is that there are limits to the amount of memory you can use for SQL Server, specifically with standard edition, because not everybody can afford enterprise. So you have to manage the amount of data that's going into memory as much as you can. And that is most effectively done by the right kind of indexes for your queries. And that's also why you don't want to have duplicate indexes, because they'll also be in memory. It's also why you don't want to have wide indexes, because they'll take up more memory than they need to. And that's why included columns are a very handy way to reduce the size of your indexes. That's why we have filtered indexes, all of these things to try and reduce the amount of data that's in memory so that we can do a lot more with what's in the buffer pool.
So then how do we go about, or what's the best ways to determine, we talked about looking at an execution plan and it kind of gives the recommended index there. So what are some good strategies to go about deciding which index we need to ignore?
Well, one approach I take on that is if I'm looking at an execution plan and it suggests an index, if it's a development environment, one of the things I'll try initially is just create the index and see how it helps, and then I'll drop it and then go look and see, is there a similar index? If the index it suggested was beneficial, I'll go and see if there's a similar index that could be modified or added to that would give the similar net effect that that suggested index was doing. And sometimes that means you're taking an existing index and just adding an include to it, or taking an existing index and adding another column into it.
Okay. So that's kind of in the dev environment, one query at a time.
Yep.
Kind of approach.
Yep. And the other approach that I see there is you can go and look at some of the missing index DMVs to go and figure out, actually, you can look at DMVs for a handful of things around indexes. One is to figure out what are the missing indexes and figure out the overall cost of data that are not going to be duplicates of other indexes, and then see how that improves performance. You can also, using DMVs, go in and look and figure out what are your duplicate indexes. If you have duplicate indexes, oftentimes you'll see that one of them might be not being used at all and another one is being used a lot. You can go in and drop one of those. However, you need to be careful when you're looking at unique indexes. You don't want to drop the unique index versus a clustered or a non-clustered index. You want to look at dropping the right one there. Another thing to look at is big clustered indexes, and that's another thing you can track down is what are the clustered indexes that are really wide. And that really wide means it's going to ripple through to all the non-clustered indexes with that extra size.
Yeah.
And you can also track down unused indexes. What are the indexes that are on your system that are not being used? Now, when you look at that one, you need to be careful because that's only going to be the ones that haven't been used since the SQL Server instance restarted. So if you rebuild an index, I believe it clears those index usage stats. Sometimes, exactly. So it's something that if you see that there's an index that's not being used, you might want to track it over a few weeks to a month and confirm that, yeah, it really isn't being used, and then go and take a look at dropping those.
That goes back to one of the best practices is to have a baseline. So know what your system is doing and track that over time. And then you can refer back to that baseline and say, well, this is exactly what's happening. This is different, and go from there. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep. And that reminds me of a project, Carlos, that you and I worked on where we set up a monitoring component that ran for a month and kept track of unused index details and logged them every few hours. And then we went back at the end of the month and reviewed the ones that over the entire month had no utilization, and then suggested those as possible candidates to be dropped.
Yeah, that's reminded me of Pinel's comment as well, that he'll only look at a database that's been running for a week. But the one thing I wanted to mention is the DMVs that you're referring to. There's one in particular. There's a group of diagnostic queries that Glenn Allen Berry from SQL Skills uses. He's created and maintains them. And so does Brent Ozar and a whole bunch of other people. But Brent Ozar's one is called SP Blitz Index, and Glenn Berry's one is included in his diagnostic scripts. It's a very similar query. And what it does is it weights your missing indexes according to number of scans, number of seeks, and something called average user impact. And now that average user impact number can be, I think it's unitless. I'm not quite sure how that number is calculated, but if it's a really high impact, like in the tens or hundreds of thousands, then usually I will go and look at that first and say, well, how many times has this index been used in terms of number of seeks and scans? And if it's a high usage index that is missing or a high impact, then I will usually create that without too many modifications if it's not too wide or doesn't have too many included columns.
Yep, good
right.
points.
I think it's the number of times requested multiplied by the number of hits.
Yep. And just to jump in there, I think I'd feel a little bit left out if I didn't have a chance to mention Database Health Monitor on that, in that in Database Health Monitor, there are many indexing reports similar to what Randolph has described there.
Certainly. From Steve Stedman Solutions has a magnificent and free tool called Database Health Monitor, which I have used. And I don't even get paid for this statement. It's a good product. It's free, which is even more amazing. This is the great thing about the SQL Server community. There are a lot of free tools that are out there that are adding value all the time. And all that people ask is that you recognize them. And I recognize Steve as a valuable member of our community. Thus ends the sponsorship message.
Thank you for the shameless plug. For the shameless plug.
So it's interesting, I guess, and maybe I'm a little bit paranoid, but so when I'm looking at that impact, and I will take that and I will say, okay, these are the ones that I'm interested in adding. Of course, I want to do what Steve mentioned of looking for duplicates or kind of what's there, right? Am I going to get over my threshold of 10 or, whatever, just kind of taking into consideration what additional load am I putting on this table by creating the index? And while you want to test that out, most of the environments that I work on, they just don't have a good mechanism for creating the similar load as they have in production. So when I go to implement that index, one of the first things I'll start to look at is those usage stats, right? Because I want the usage stats of the index that I just created to be going up. Because then I know that, okay, well, wait a second, what did I do? Is this really still a good candidate?
Yeah, that's a very good point.
A couple of other things that we didn't really, it's really still a good candidate.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
A couple of other things that we didn't really get into some of the other new indexes like Columnstore or even XML indexes. But I guess other thoughts about when to start looking at these other, do we even want to try to approach that now? Maybe I feel like we should punt on some of those.
I can briefly mention about XML indexes. The way they work is they are going to be larger than your table or your XML column. The reason being is that it will create an internal table according to the structure of the XML document or the XML field that you're indexing. So it actually expands out the XML data into an internal table and then indexes that. So you could end up with a column that is, let's say, 100 kilobytes maximum. That's a small one. And you could end up with an index that is 500 kilobytes. Two-way internal table under the covers, a system table that it is then indexing. So be wary of XML columns in that if you're going to index them, make sure that they are sensible indexes, that they're only indexing certain nodes inside that XML document, and be aware of that. And also, I'd like to add here that if you use the XML data type, the data going into that XML row or column is not going to be the same as what you get out. It does modify the XML data going in for whatever reasons.
Say that one more time.
If you have XML data that you put in for auditing reasons, for example.
Okay.
If you pull it out, it's going to have been modified somehow.
Really?
Either the tags will be slightly different or the spacing will be slightly different. So do not use an XML data type to store audited records of XML types. If you want to keep an absolute record of what your XML looked like as it came out of a web service or for whatever reason, store it in a varchar or an nvarchar varchar column instead, because then it is identical. If you put it into an XML data type, it will modify the data. It's still the same data, but it'll be slightly modified. The tags will be slightly different or whatever.
So then as far as Columnstore indexes, I think that's something we could probably dedicate an entire episode just to talk about.
We definitely can.
I think you're right.
A Columnstore index is neither an index nor clustered. So
Exactly.
It's so complicated. In fact, there's a series of posts. I think it's Nico who's done it.
Yep.
For how Columnstore indexes work. We could talk for days on that. They're fascinating and completely subverts what you think you know about indexes and data and row level storage and all of that kind of stuff. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. And just a few notes on that. I think that it's one of those things that is great for data warehousing or OLAP type things and may not always be the best option for your Oltp side.
At the same time, you could have reporting style queries in your database, and with 2016's optimizations for Columnstore, you could have, which can change and can be clustered and all sorts of stuff.
Yep.
You could have some stuff in your Oltp environment that could be OLAP style indexes. So yeah, there's so much to think about there.
Yeah, we saw that in episode 78 with Brian Carrig. They talked about using their Columnstore index in a functional environment.
And then one of the things that I've seen that's one of those misunderstandings around column stores is that because column store does the compression on each column, is that people think of it as, I don't have to have any non-clustered indexes if I have a column store index. And that's not true at all. And that if you're working with a bigger table and you're using column store, you may still need to have some non-clustered indexes on it as well.
Oh, yeah. So do your research, read all 100 and whatever posts it is.
Yep.
Become an expert and then implement them.
So we've talked a little bit about implications. How do we know, what to use? So space considerations, we talked a little bit about more in the rebuild process, right? That we're going to need additional space in our data file and our log file, things like that. I think we've had a pretty good conversation there. I guess one last idea I'll throw out that we can bat around a little bit. We talk a lot about having multiple TempDB files. So one of the thoughts that I've seen out there is if you're looking to spread out or move your indexes from where your data might reside, right? One way to do that would be to create another data file, potentially on a separate storage, and then rebuild those indexes.
Okay, there's two things that I can talk about there. The first thing I wanted to mention is if you do need to move your table into a different file or file group, all you have to do is do a clustered index rebuild and target that file group as the new location for the clustered index, because remember, the clustered index is your data. So that's a handy way. If you need to move your table into a different file group, that's how you would do it. The other thing is, by virtue of that definition there, is that you could have your non-clustered indexes in a different file as your data. And you might want that for improved I/O performance, or if you've got your read-only I/O performance, or if you've got your read-only stuff in a different file group, or all sorts of reasons for that. It's very handy for splitting your load on the I/O level. Less of a problem these days, but it's a nice thing for large tables to split your non-clustered indexes from your clustered index so that it's not reading from the same portion of the disk or the I/O subsystem for both.
Right.
And just a note on that index rebuild for a clustered index to move it to a different file group, although that will move the table and the entire index, one of the things that can get left behind when you do that is any of the varchar max or nvarchar max or other large items that are located outside of the data pages for that table.
Off-row, off-row data will be affected. Steve, I don't know, because I've never tried, what happens if you tell it to do the index rebuild with the lob compaction enabled?
That's a good question. I have not tried that for a long time.
Good. Well, awesome. I think great conversation. Obviously, there's lots more that we could talk about indexes, but I think this was a noble attempt at covering some of the basics and getting into some of the nitty-gritty as well.
Yeah, and the fact is that indexes don't stand by themselves. They are a very important part of everything, including statistics and everything else. So,
right. Good point.
Don't think that once you become an index expert, you're going to be a performance tuning expert, because that's not true. You have to have a very broad knowledge of how things work in a number of different fields, excuse the pun, to get the best performance out of your system. And there's nothing wrong with good enough. You don't have to have 100% defragged indexes. You don't have to have indexes rebuilt. You can have them reorganized. You don't have to have them reorganized at all if your statistics are up to date in certain contexts. So there are a lot of trade-offs that you have to think about when plans, and indexes form just a small part of that.
Great.
Very good points.
So should we do SQL family?
Let's do it.
Let's do SQL family.
So how did you first get started with SQL Server, Randolph?
Steve, that's a good question, because when I originally got this question, I had to think very hard about it. I have been fascinated from a personal level about organizing data. Back in my youth, I would create lists and lists of things, CDs, books, all that kind of stuff. And I would do them in the paper equivalent of Microsoft Excel. And then when Lotus 123 came along, I started playing with that. because my dad worked at the bank and he was a 123 expert. If I'd known about VisiCalc, I probably would have used it. And then I got into Microsoft Access because it was there. It was a very old version of Access. I think it was version 2 that I started with. And then I started working at a PeopleSoft implementation partner in South Africa, where I'm from. And that's where I first saw SQL Server and Oracle at the same time. And I was not a fan of SQL Server. I have to be honest. At the time, it was version 6.5 and version 7. That's around the time I joined. So there were issues because, as some of your listeners may know, SQL Server's engine was rebuilt around 6.5, 7 time. In fact, if you look on MSDN, you can download 6.5 and you can download 2000, but you cannot download version 7. It is very difficult to come by. There may be good reasons for that. So I got exposed to SQL Server that would have been 1997, around there. So yeah, that's where I first got exposed to it. And then I didn't really play with it until I got to the bank. I was more an Oracle guy. Got to the bank in 2006. So there was a large gap of not playing with SQL Server. And then I couldn't figure out why the keyword describe wasn't working in SQL Server. So for all of you Oracle aficionados there, I prefer SQL Server now because, as I said before, a lot has changed. It is a much better product than it was back in 1997.
Sure.
In fact, I think it has surpassed Oracle. I think it's better than anything else as well. And that's because I'm trying to keep abreast of all the new stuff. I don't want to be stuck in the past and have assumptions about the products. I want to play around with the new stuff. So
yep.
That was a long way of saying 20 years or so.
Okay. Well, I know that in the late 90s, Oracle was a much better product than SQL Server.
It really was. And it ran everywhere.
Yep. And that's changed. That's changed significantly in the last 17 years.
Yeah, it has. So
If you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be?
I had a pat answer for this, but I'm going to change my mind. The pat answer is in-memory processing on SQL Server, in-memory Oltp, which was called Hekaton. That was the code name for it. Mm-hmm. There is a transaction log operation that happens even for stuff that you don't want kept. It's still being backed by disk somewhere. It may not be in the transaction log itself, but it's still being backed by disk somewhere. I would like to have in-memory objects that do not have anything on disk backing them at all. They must just be there. And if the server goes down, oh well, tough luck.
Yes, I remember seeing you in the Bob Ward presentation at SQL Pass talking about the in-memory OLTP.
Yeah, there's some very, very cool stuff with in-memory OLTP that I've been playing with. I've been blogging about it as well on my blog, bornsql.ca. That some in-memory ops. Interestingly, I found another issue that I've spoken to Jonathan Cahias about, where temp tables are slower than temp variables in certain cases. So I'm investigating that at the moment, and it had to do with my in-memory investigations.
Oh, interesting. I'd like to see what you find there.
Oh, if I could change, that was my pat answer about SQL Server, what I would change. What I would change is having a temp DB per user database as a configurable extra.
Ooh, so that would be nice.
In other words, it doesn't have to be default, but if I need a temp DB for a particular database, I would like to have that as a separate entity so that I could manage it separately and keep track of the objects that are happening for that particular database. The architecture for that is going to be really difficult to do. So I don't know if Microsoft's going to do that, but that's what I would like.
So what's the best piece of career advice that you've received?
Oh, it's going to be a long answer as well. Sorry. Let your work speak for itself is the first and foremost one. So it doesn't matter what people say about you. If your work can speak for itself, then you don't have to say anything. That's the best piece of advice I've had. But the other thing is, everything you say and everything you do is being recorded somewhere. So please treat people with respect. Treat people as you would have them treat you, and don't say things on voicemails that can be played back to you at meetings with the CEO and saying, Randolph, don't do that.
I like that too.
we won't ask for the personal experience that led you to that advice. But
I have, at the end of the year, or every now and then when it's a quiet time on my blog, I say career limiting moves. And that was one of them. So There are a bunch of career limiting moves that I can recommend to you. Don't do because I've done them. Not because it's good advice, but it's because I've done them. So don't do that because I've done it. And that would be one of them.
All right.
If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
I thought about this and I honestly don't know. I liked Penal's one where he could touch a server and know what's wrong with it. The problem is whenever I touch a server, if it's going to break then and there. So maybe I want the reverse of that superpower.
To just know without touching the server?
Yeah, percussive maintenance is one thing, but if I'm in a room and it is going to break, it's going to break while I'm there. So, which is good, I guess, in a way, because then you know that we can figure it out then and there. But I'd like the reverse of that. That would be cool.
Okay.
Well, awesome. Randolph, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a topic near and dear to my heart, indexing and maintenance and stuff like that. So I'm glad I got an opportunity to speak to you guys about it.
Okay, well, we'd like to thank Randolph again for coming in and talking with us. Again, so everyone's enjoyed the conversation today.
It's always good to talk with someone who's so knowledgeable on a specific topic. So one of the things on the whole care and feeding side of things is that Microsoft does, I don't know, kind of an okay job with maintenance plans and being able to put together things there that will help you with your indexing and statistics and all that, but they don't always point out what everything's going to do. And I think that using a tool like the Ola Hallegren script, I mean, I've used that at many, many clients, and it's one of those things that can really change the whole structure around how you're doing your maintenance around statistics and reindexing and all that, change it in a really good way. So
yes,
definitely a good thing to check out there is the Ola Hallegren scripts.
Well, and I had never kind of going back to those maintenance plans, you grumble about why they put some of those things in the order that they do, but I hadn't considered, well, if you just go through and you start checking the boxes, that's the order they're going to get put in. And I'm like, oh, again, it get put in. And I'm like, oh, again, it makes sense, right? If you think you're trying to help the situation, you're using the tool, and in a sense, the tool is kind of working against you a little bit.
Right. And it's more of a user interface on the whole maintenance plan building tool that throws that off. So definitely check out some of the other tools out there for doing that. And I think that indexes are great, but well-maintained indexes are even better.
That's right.
Good stuff.
Yep. Of course, if you have thoughts about how the conversation, you think we missed something, of course, you can reach out to us. You can send us an email, or you can reach out to us on Twitter. I am at Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am at SQL EMT. We
have several good episodes coming up that I think everyone will be interested in. We've got conversations about the SQL T framework, becoming an MVP. Javier, to look episode 2 from Argentina. We'll be talking a little bit about his conversion to 2016, some of the issues they had. So that's what we have to look forward to. We'd also like to once again, mention this idea that we're putting together for a mini conference, right? So if you're a DBA, the only DBA in your shop, you're working with a lot of off-the-shelf products, and you'd like to expand your network and kind of get information that most pertains to you, we'd like to hear from you. You can go to sqldatapartners.com/conference. Let us know that you're interested. And then as we, if we can get a few people together, we'll start putting out some information about how we'll put that together. I think that's going to do it for this show. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you guys on the SQL Trail.